I'm Shaun Francis, the host of the Eat, Move, Think podcast. Welcome to our show, and want to welcome Dr. Jaideep Bains, who is a neuroscientist and researcher, and most importantly, the director of the Krembil Research Institute at UHN. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Shaun. Thanks for having me. It's really a delight to be here.
Maybe just for our listeners, and we were just talking in advance of this, what's your background? I know you're spending your time now between University of Calgary and in the UHN.
So I'm trained as a physiologist. I've been at the University of Calgary for the last 22 years. I have a research lab that studies stress and how stress is interpreted by the brain and modifies the brain, and have just moved recently, 6 months ago, to UHN to be the director of the Krembil.
And how did you get into, why don't you describe just how you got into physiology and then to be so focused on the brain aspect of it?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, so I'm one of those people who's not your traditional scientist. I had very little interest in science when I was in university. Kind of stumbled into a lab in my fourth year. Decided to give graduate school a try and just really liked it and found that I was good at it. And so being one of those path of least resistance people, I just kept doing it because I felt it was relatively easy. It wasn't that it was easy, but it felt easy for me.
Yes.
And so I just kept going. And the lab I was working in was looking at different areas of the brain that were important in controlling blood pressure. And so I got interested in that and then started to learn more about how single cells in the brain communicated with each other through electrical and chemical signals, and then decided to apply that knowledge to look at regions of the brain that control the stress response.
What is that connection? Like, how did that evolve?
Yeah, so a little bit was just looking for opportunities and spaces where I could apply my training as what is called a synaptic physiologist, so somebody who tries to understand how the connections between cells in the brain, which are called synapses, work. And so the area of the brain I was working in, the hippocampus, which is really important for memory formation, is also a site of seizure initiation in epilepsy. And so that area was quite a crowded area. There were a lot of big labs, and I looked over and saw that stress was a really important topic, but we had really limited understanding of the synaptic connections and how they worked and how they were modified by stress. So part of it is I saw an opportunity to develop a career, and then part of it was I thought stress was a fascinating subject to get into.
You just mentioned that less was understood. What have you discovered in this journey of your career?
Yeah, so there are a number of things. We discovered that there are very specific kind of windows that open after stress in the brain. In other words, after stress, the brain or the synapses in the brain can undergo a lot of plasticity. So they can undergo very rapid changes. And these changes can persist for hours to days sometimes. And it's these changes that are fascinating because these lasting changes in how cells in the brain communicate with each other are what sow the seeds for some of the negative things that we associated with stress, like long-lasting mental health impacts, different types of other disorders.
And what is the physiology behind that?
So when an individual is stressed, when you are in a stressful situation, there is the release of a number of different chemical mediators in your brain, throughout your brain. We focus on one particular area of the brain, which has kind of a long name, the paraventricular nucleus of the hypothalamus. And the reason we focus on this area is because it contains a set of cells that make a hormone called corticotropin-releasing hormone. And this hormone controls secretion from the pituitary gland, which most people will have heard of, and initiates a cascade in the body, culminating in the release of cortisol from the adrenal glands. And so we thought, okay, well, here are the endocrine control cells in the brain that control this cortisol release. How do we begin to understand how stress signals and other chemicals in the brain can control these cells? And so there are a number of key chemicals. One of them, of course, is noradrenaline. And so we know of noradrenaline and adrenaline, right? Everyone has heard of this. This is that big arousal signal. So initially, when you're in a stressful situation, just about any organism immediately has to figure out a way to deal with that stress. It's often a threatening situation, or our brain perceives it as threatening. And so we launch this cascade of reactions in our body, including a rapid increase in our breathing, an increase in our blood pressure, in our heart rate. So general arousal to basically evade the situation if necessary, fight if necessary, right? Or hide if necessary. As part of that response, these CRH neurons become activated and release cortisol. So now cortisol is not part of that initial fight or flight or escape response, but it's really important in getting your body to be able to respond to what has happened. So cortisol, for example, mobilizes glucose in the body, right? And so it's going to overcome the energetic deficit you're going to incur when you have this rapid initiation of action. And so we started to study very locally in the hypothalamus, what are the chemical changes, what are the different proteins that are involved, how does this system store memories and information? And then, more recently, we've become fascinated by this kind of what started as an outlandish idea, but now has really emerged into something that is based on concrete biology. And that is the idea that stress is transmitted from one individual to another. We initially got into it because we had heard about this idea called social contagion, right? That ideas can permeate through society very quickly. We started to think about whether physiological signals like stress or emotional states, which stress is associated with, could also permeate like that. And if so, how does that happen? And if it does happen, does that transmitted stress have the same consequences on the brain that an actual or authentic stress does?
What did you discover? I mean, is that, I know that a group of people might become stressed,
Yeah.
Quote unquote, given the similar situation.
Right.
But are you saying that a person in that group who happens to be stressed
Yeah.
might affect the others
Correct.
becoming more stressed?
Correct. So, for example, if I were stressed, or if I had had a very stressful experience, I could walk home and 10 minutes later transmit that to my wife without necessarily explicitly communicating information about my day. So without telling her, I had a terrible day, this was a stressful situation. It turns out that we, along with many other organisms, have this ability to transmit information, and we transmit it through glands in our skin, through our sweat glands. So we release molecules that others can detect that tell them about our emotional state. It sounds a little bit outlandish, right? But there are some really nice experiments, not done by us, but by others around the world, looking at these molecules and looking at how they influence arousal in others and decision-making in others.
Sometimes I think I can tell if someone's stressed
Right.
by how they're holding their body
Sure.
or how they're talking, but it might be too that they're actually emitting
Yeah.
molecules
Yeah.
that could be signaling that to me.
Yeah, you've said something very important. I think we as human beings have this very complex cortex, right, which has all of this sensory input. We're highly visual creatures, right? So we process visual signals very quickly and very fast. And you're right, posture is exactly one of those things that you can kind of tell something's not right, especially when you know people well. But the emerging research suggests that there are also these chemical olfactory cues, right, that we detect in the air. But what's cool about them is that we don't know we're detecting them. So they can be at levels that we don't consciously perceive, but other areas of the brain that are not necessarily part of our conscious awareness of the world do sense them. And the hypothalamus, where these stress command neurons sit, that's one of those areas of the brain.
And is this, and what might have been the evolutionary reason for this?
Yeah. So we in society think of stress as a bad thing, but the stress response is actually a good thing, right? Because that's the thing that allows you to survive. If you don't have it, if an organism doesn't have it, it doesn't survive. And so evolutionarily, we think about stress transmission like this. If you're a creature in the wild and you've experienced or you've run into a predator but managed to escape, the ability to come back and transmit information that you were just exposed to a threat is critical for survival of those around you, right? And those around you in the wild are usually genetically related. And so that confers some adaptive advantage to pass on your genes. And one of the reasons we think the signals are chemo signals or olfactory signals is that you don't want to alert a predator to your location. And so an auditory signal in which you have a call actually doesn't make sense, right? Because immediately a predator knows where you are. And so you transmit this silent stress signal to others. They pick it up and they change their behaviors and actions accordingly.
That's fascinating.
Yeah.
And what are those? They're more hypervigilant. Is that like what does stress do to you? Or is that the cortisol that's actually creating that sensation?
It does increase cortisol levels, but it's not cortisol that's creating the sensation.
Okay.
So it's in others recruiting those similar noradrenergic pathways, activating other brain areas that increase awareness and arousal around you. But one of the interesting things is that this stress that is transmitted leaves the same changes on the connections between cells that the actual stress does. So that's the part that we found really fascinating, is that we were imprinting something on the brain through this transmitted stress that to us appeared virtually identical to the imprint that was left with the authentic stress.
In terms of stress levels or how evolved that is, does it help in your, I mean, it evidently helps in your overall survival.
Yep.
In performance in general?
Yep. So, a small amount of stress is really a good thing. It does help you perform better. It does help you get up for things, for lack of a better term, right? It sharpens you in the moment, right? So I think it's really, really effective. One of the other things that we've discovered, which is really interesting, is that it's not necessarily the intensity of the stress that matters, but it's whether individuals feel like they have control over the outcome in a stressful situation versus not having control. So individuals that perceive that they have control in a stressful situation have much better outcomes and it can accomplish tasks. Individuals exposed to the same stress who feel like they have no control over the outcome seem to take on the negative consequences of stress. Those are the ones that you see who start to exhibit more anxiety-like phenotypes, who may go on to develop things like depression. So that controllability aspect of stress is a really, really important piece.
This might be somewhat tangential, but it triggered me to, think about your earlier example of how stress is, helps you decide if you're going to fight, hide, escape. But we often hear about people doing none of the above. They freeze.
That's right.
How does that weave into this?
That's a great question. So that's right. I mean, a freeze response is one of the multiple defensive behaviors we have available to us. The freezing response is that response that basically says, please don't notice me. I'm not going to make a movement, right? And so what we found in our work and others have found is that those exposed to uncontrollable stress tend to exhibit more freezing type behaviors. Those exposed to controllable stress exhibit more action-oriented behaviors. Having control during the stress also causes some changes in your brain that say, whatever I'm faced with, I'm going to be able to engage in a behavior and take charge and succeed. Whereas in the other case, you tend to just shut down and not engage at all.
I know Navy SEAL training in particular, but it's all about what do you do when you come across a bear in the woods, and they said that human reaction, of course, is not necessarily to fight, but to run, maybe to freeze, hide, but in their situation they have to fight, which is probably the opposite of what you typically would be compelled to do physiologically. But it's through training, I think, giving them the toolkit to feel like they can control the situation, that they feel they can overcome that stress, but it has to be really repetitive.
That's it. Yeah. So it's practice, which allows you to then plan when you're in the moment, knowing that you have a chance for a positive outcome. That's really what that's really what practicing is about, right?
Yes. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Same with pilots, right? Where you've been there, you've done it, you train for it. So when it happens,
Yep.
you just
Same
go
with pilots. Same with athletes.
athletes.
Yeah. Yeah. Our Toronto Maple Leafs could use that a little bit, I think.
Could use that. Is being stressed out, does that lead to burnout, or are these things connected?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, so what I've been talking about mostly is acute stress, a particular situation where you're faced with a challenge, you have to overcome the challenge. The burnout scenario is usually associated with chronic stress, this kind of ambient level of stress that doesn't go away. So normally our bodies are designed in this really clever way that you launch this stress response, and this stress response, cortisol in particular, feeds back and tells the brain, shut it down, we're good, right? So there's this, what's called a negative feedback loop. And that tells the brain, I've dealt with the stress, cortisol levels are high, you can turn off the stress response. So what happens, and we don't understand how this happens, in some individuals, that off switch is not working properly. And so areas of your brain continue to remain in this very vigilant, aroused, stressed state. Could it be that they're not listening to cortisol properly? That's one possibility, and that's something that we're looking into. Could it be that they've found a way to escape this negative feedback and adapted to a new way of doing things, these particular circuits in the brain? That's absolutely a possibility. Could it be that cortisol is just less effective through the way that it interacts with its receptors and binding sites in the brain? That's another possibility. So those are all things that we're looking into.
And how does that, what is burnout? And what is this eventual negative reaction?
So, burnout is kind of, I guess, behaviorally, we would describe it as this kind of general malaise, inability to become engaged in tasks that normally, you would have no problem with, things you're proficient at, things you're excited about. This desire to kind of withdraw a little bit from the world, and maybe also getting back to what we talked about earlier, a little bit of this feeling of helplessness, that you're unable to achieve whatever you set out to achieve. And so a lot of that has been linked to high circulating cortisol levels, and also high circulating levels of cytokines, which are inflammatory factors that are in your blood.
And is adrenaline related? Like, you can't get the adrenaline rush? Is that part of it? Or in other words?
Yeah, I think some people talk about this. They're like, I'm just not getting the same buzz about doing things. People who are depressed report similar symptoms around this. So the mechanics of it are really very poorly understood.
Yeah. And how is anxiety related to this? Meaning, it's because people might say I'm stressed out, or I feel anxiety. They seem to be interchangeable.
Yeah. Stress and anxiety are often used interchangeably. Yeah. So, you need to have some level of anxiety in situations that are unfamiliar, right? You want to have a heightened level of awareness, right? Situational awareness. That's kind of what anxiety is. That's the good anxiety. But when that transfers into situations that you're completely familiar with and should be safe, yet, you walk out of the door of your house, which you've been out of 1,000 times, and all of a sudden you can't take the next step because you feel hyper anxious and almost debilitated. That's a trait of anxiety which is negative. And there's a really tight link between stress and anxiety. So many have argued that stressful experiences, especially intensely stressful experiences, can trip the switch between having that appropriate anxiety response versus having that inappropriate anxiety response. So your threshold for what you consider to be anxiety provoking has changed.
And how does this whole topic then relate to overall health and wellness? It sounds like there's a normal physiological stress response and cycle. But what should be our takeaway in terms of how this feeds into overall wellness?
Sure. Yeah, we always think of, it's very easy to think of, good and bad around stress, but I think there's an optimal level around stress. So, researchers since the 1940s and 50s have been talking about this kind of U-shape curve around stress, that too little stress is not a good thing because that means you're not able to engage when you actually need to engage. Too much stress is not a good thing. And so there's an optimal level of stress that you need to be able to engage with when specific situations arise. The challenge and the things that we think about a lot are when that stress response just remains on. Because remaining on has a lot of other consequences. For example, if you're continually, mobilizing glucose, it's been linked to the onset of type 2 diabetes. There are demonstrated effects of cortisol and other circulating cytokines on your heart, on your blood vessels. We know that persistently high levels of cortisol do a lot of things to your memory, your ability to not only form memory, but also recall information. So all of those are the bad consequences. And so we're trying to figure out how to mitigate those without really touching the normal stress response.
And when you say figuring that out, is that medical intervention? Is that psychological interventions?
I would say it's probably both. I would say for sure we know that, there are some very obvious things that lower our levels of ambient or chronic stress. For example, exercise works really well. As long as it's exercise that people are enjoying, right, and feel like it's benefiting them. It can't be a forced exercise.
Mm-hmm.
That tends to work less well. We know that sleep works really well, right? We know that changing your diet works really well. That could be through changes in your microbiome. It's still unclear, but there's a fascinating area of research around how changes in your gut microbiome through the foods you eat change how different circuits in your brain work and alters behavior, right? It could also be, it definitely is having, positive social interactions and engaging. I talked earlier about social interactions transmitting stress, but social interactions can also help you buffer stress. And that's a really important piece of that, right? It allows us to talk it out or sweat it out or do whatever and help relieve some of the negative consequences of stress.
What are you focused on now at the Krembil Center?
In terms of my research in stress?
Yes,
yeah. So one of the things that we're really, really fascinated about is, are there specific time periods after a stressful event during which you could think about interventional strategies? So we know that these cells I talked about, these CRH neurons that turn on during stress, when stress is over, they still adopt a very specific type of activity, electrical activity pattern. And we think that's giving us a clue. That's telling us there might be this window of opportunity where we might be able to intervene. And so we've been thinking about strategies around that. For example, is that the right time to exercise after stress? Is that the right time? So one of the things that works reasonably well for stress, and I think we all know this, is consuming food that has high hedonic value. So we can think about things like chocolate or chips, classic kind of junk foody things that make you feel, that actually people say make you feel better, right?
Yes, yeah.
So could those things be helping to erase the imprints that stress has left on your brain, right? So we don't know that, but we're really fascinated because, we know that we can't intervene during the stress because we don't know when it's going to happen. But for an hour after, do we have a chance? Yeah, I think there may be a shot, and that's really what we're focusing a lot of our efforts on.
It sounds like some people might be over stressed or chronically stressed.
Yeah.
We don't understand that, and we're looking to see if we can help with that.
Yeah.
But what else are we? Is there something else that, from a medical discovery and therapy perspective, we're looking for?
I think one of the challenges in the medical field around stress is that we need to be able to measure good stress signals in real time.
Mm-hmm.
We don't have them. So we have heart rate, we have blood pressure, we have respiration or breathing, and we can put those things together, come up with some formula and say, that's stress. But it's not really stress because those things change in a lot of different factors in our lives. So can we get clean biological signals, not just clues or cues, but actual real signals that we can start to say, in real time, that's a stress signal. And if we start to detect those signals, can we intervene at the right time and start to think about this? I think those are real challenges, because I think when we're dealing with people, there's a lot of guesswork involved, and a lot of it is getting people to a point where they're feeling better and then able to convey that to you. Lots of people say they're feeling better, but they're not always feeling better.
I'm trying to recall, aren't there like devices many years ago, I recall like a ring would turn a different color, or remembering that right?
Yeah. There was like this kind of quasi mood ring, right? That would like turn red or something, and people were wearing this. There are rings like, and those were largely based on, I think, heart rate and changes in maybe temperature in your fingers. There are others, including us, who are starting to think about devices that are wearable, because we know that cortisol is also released in your sweat.
Yes.
And so can we detect those? Can we detect them in real time? And can that be a real signal that tells us something? The challenge is going to be every individual is going to have a different signature.
Yes.
And so dialing that in and finding the right baseline level is going to be important. And cortisol is not perfect, because cortisol also goes up. For example, as you're waking up in the morning, there's a huge spike in cortisol. When you exercise, there's a big increase in cortisol. And so you would have to learn a lot about an individual's day-to-day rhythms and variabilities, and just track, and then figure out what is the stress signal and what is just the regular biological signals that are part of the person's physiology.
And when you mentioned the molecules earlier, and emitting the molecules, is that cortisol molecules or other?
So cortisol is one of the molecules.
Yes.
We think there are better, faster molecules, and we're still trying to figure out what those are. So there are other labs around the world who think they have a handle on it. Some of them are proprietary, so you don't know exactly what they are. So we're trying to figure out, can we get a quick response? Because cortisol will take tens of minutes, if not a little bit longer, to start to peak to a level that you can detect. So it won't happen immediately when you're stressed. And so it gives us a signal, but it's a late signal.
Yes.
And so we're trying to think about, are there early signals that we can detect and perhaps intervene? We don't know if that's a possibility, but it may be the type of thing where you could tell yourself, or your body through a wearable device could tell your phone, right, that you're starting to experience high levels of stress.
It may not be a cliche, because you talked about behavioral interventions, right? But you think about the yogi, or the Buddha, who appear at least to be low stressed.
I'm fascinated by this idea, this concept of that you can kind of adopt physical regimens that control your breathing, right? Slow your breathing down, can slow your heart rate down. All of these systems are connected, right? So cells that control your blood pressure actually talk to the cells that control your stress response, right? The cells that control your breathing are influenced by the cells that control your stress response. So it's this interconnected network. So it doesn't surprise me at all that you can start to override some of these systems, right, in a very deliberate way, right? So I think it's fascinating. Yeah.
Jaideep, you talked about topics that I talk about all the time on general wellness, which is eat better, sleep better, move more. Are those tactics you employ in terms of your own stress relief kit?
So I mean, in general, those are good guidelines to live by for anybody, I think. For me, I can tell you that when I am stressed, I immediately try to employ those, starting with breathing and then starting to move. Movement is a huge thing for me personally, that it just allows you to, almost for lack of a better term, shake out that stress, that you kind of feel stuck by it, and moving really helps me get through it. I also know when I'm stressed because I don't sleep well. And so then it's always a challenge to find a way to sleep well when you're stressed, because it's the stress that is not allowing you to sleep well. And so how do you overcome that? And some of the things you start to do is start to very deliberately establish a routine around that. and try to, and if you don't feel like sleeping, don't force yourself to sleep. It's not going to happen, right? That will just frustrate you even more, right? One of the things that I know stress me out are when you've planned out a day and all of a sudden things jump in and you've totally lost control of things. That, for me, and I think for most people, is extremely stressful. And so finding a way to regain that control is really, really important. And sometimes it just requires you to unplug for 15, 20 minutes, go for a brisk walk, reset yourself, and come back and restart again. I think those are the types of things I try to do. And it's always one of those easier said than done things, because sometimes you're in the moment and there are things that just need to get done and there's no other way around it. But I would say that once you've done them, find a way after the stress is over in that window, right, to do things that are interventional in a very positive way that can help you.
I know that, one of the stereotypes for some people with respect to stress is they go for a cigarette.
Yeah.
And it's interesting that seems to calm you down.
Yeah.
But I know, that's generally accepted as probably not a good habit.
Yeah.
But people might also go for a cocktail. They might go for cannabis.
Yeah.
Why do we seek out these interventions, and what's your thought on those?
Sure. Yeah. So there's a fascinating kind of scientific literature around this. We know we do this, right? I do this as well. Like, meet a friend for a gin and tonic after a tough day. Sure. Lots of people do it. And so the emerging literature around this is that alcohol has really profound effects on your brain, right? Short-term alcohol consumption. And one of the things that it does is it helps to turn off your stress axis. It does that in the short term. The challenge is that alcohol long-term has a lot of other consequences in your brain, right? And it leads to long-term changes in your reward circuitry. And so you begin to seek it out because you start to develop this dependence on it. And so that becomes your normal. And then it starts to impair behavior. It starts to impair motor function. It starts to impair decision-making. And it starts to amp up your stress response. And so the thing that you start with to mitigate your stress response actually turns it on its head and makes you more likely to become stressed, more likely to become anxious. And so that's a really tricky one. So cannabis is interesting because our brain has its own cannabinoid system. So there's a set of molecules called endocannabinoids, and they're found throughout our body. They're made from lipid precursors, and these endocannabinoids are used in the brain from one cell to signal to another. And so what cannabis does, the active ingredient in cannabis, which is THC, so THC binds to the brain's endogenous cannabinoid receptors, and it triggers some of these effects. For example, a very calming effect, right? Because in the brain's own systems, endocannabinoids help offset the effects of stress. And so these exogenous molecules like THC hijack the brain's own system, right, to have these effects. And so this is why people who take cannabis will often report that they're feeling relaxed, that they don't feel as stressed, because our brain circuits have these endogenous mechanisms to respond to these chemicals.
But is there a negative to that?
Is there a negative to cannabis consumption? Excessive, yes. I think for anything excessive, there always is. A lot of folks have been looking for things like, is cannabis addictive? Are there long-term consequences of cannabis? And I think the research is just too early to know. Anecdotally, people would suggest the addictive properties of cannabis are not like alcohol or other recreational drugs. But I think it's only been since the legalization in Canada that we've started to do some of these studies and have had access to some of these compounds. So I think it's still an open question.
This is fascinating. Thank you.
Yeah, my pleasure.
Yeah, very much for sharing this with us and for all the great and exciting work that you're doing in the domain of brain research.
Of course. Yeah, thank you for having me.
Yeah, it's a real delight.
Cool.